Have you ever felt conflicted about something, like there was a war going on in your head between parts of you with different agendas? Do you ever get frustrated with yourself for behaving in self-defeating ways, only to find yourself repeating that same behavior over and over again? Well, you, my friend, might have a mind comprised of many different parts, each with their own origin story, attachments, aversions, duties, and burdens. In today's episode of the Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers podcast, we are revisiting the concept of intrapsychic multiplicity, or internal parts, through the lens of internal family systems therapy, or IFS. We discuss the idea of internal parts found in other personality theories and psychotherapy modalities, flesh out the basics of IFS, explore how IFS can be used in psychedelic-assisted therapy, discuss what it's like to go through formal level 1 IFS training, and much, much more. For those of you who are new to the show, welcome. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinus and is hosted by me, Dr. Steve Thayer, and my co-host, Dr. Reed Robison. Just a few announcements before we get into today's episode. If you're looking for professional training pursuant to becoming a psychedelic-assisted practitioner, check out the courses we offer here at Numinus. Click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinus.com/training and use the code PTF10 for 10% off selected trainings. If you've listened to the show for a while, you've likely heard Reed and myself talk about the psychedelic clinical trial work that Numinus does. If you're living in Utah and you or someone you know might be interested in being a participant in a psychedelic clinical trial, you can click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinus.com/research to learn more about the trials we're currently running. If you'd like to support our show, you can do so by leaving us a rating or review in places like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If you're watching on YouTube, you can like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, maybe even share the episode with somebody you think might enjoy it. Without further delay, here is today's episode on internal parts and IFS. So, Reed, I just got back from the lovely state of Oregon. I was out there for level 1, sort of the first on-site retreat-style training for IFS, level 1 IFS training.
Give us a trip report.
Yeah, right? I mean, anybody who's listened to more than one episode has probably heard us talk about parts, like internal parts, intrapsychic multiplicity in some way, shape, or form. We've also had Dick Schwartz on the podcast. We interviewed him. He's the creator of Internal Family Systems. We had Nick Bruce on a little while ago. He is a practitioner of internal family systems in his ketamine practice. I think when we've talked about it before, we've talked about it as one of those therapies that often pairs well with psychedelics. It influenced the MAPS protocol for MDMA-assisted therapy, Michael and Annie Mithofer being IFS therapists, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, under the idea that parts may spontaneously emerge during psychedelic therapy sessions, including with MDMA, and therefore parts work is often a useful modality, especially in preparation for getting ready for what may emerge, but also in the integration sessions, even day of. It's a framework that the individual can use. One possible framework that we find quite useful that you can use to make sense of the nonsensical.
Right. Yeah, and I like describing it as a framework. Right. So, I mean, we're fresh off the heels of our conversations about the FDA saying no to MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD, the MAPS studies. And one of the just outlandish, I think, criticisms that we talked about being that it's a therapy cult. And, speaking about the psychotherapy world broadly, there are some psychotherapeutic approaches that have a lot of sort of research support, traditional research support, like cognitive behavioral therapy and other therapies based on it. And then there are some that have maybe less research support of that kind. And IFS does have some research support. But my point is that I'll tell a bit of a story to drive my point home. How about that? When I'm out there in Oregon, getting trained in this model, this modality, this way of thinking about the human psyche and how it suffers and how we can help relieve that suffering, I did at one point feel like I'm in that room, we're all sharing, we're talking about the model, and then there was this sense that it's being reified. By that I mean, like, this is reality. This is how human beings are structured. And the notion of the capital S self that we can talk about a little bit being sort of this birthright, and some spirituality being woven in the discussion. And so I've got a skeptical part, to use the language, that reacts to that and pushes back hard. And so, the idea of a therapy cult was fresh in my mind. I'm not saying that I thought, oh no, I'm joining an IFS therapy cult. That was not the vibe they were giving off.
But you like to keep a healthy cult
Skepticism.
radar on board at all times, including therapy cults and whatever other cults.
Yeah. And I brought this up with a lot of my other, co-learners, even some of the
No, I'm
the
glad you're
program
bringing this up.
assistants. And it was something that they all held really, really openly and some people could relate to. And so I like to circling back to your point about it being a framework. I like to think of IFS, like with other psychotherapies and personality theories, as a framework, maybe even a metaphor for thinking about how it appears, the mind operates. So whether or not that means that the capital S self or the inner healing tendency or intelligence is a real measurable substance thing, or it exists on the quantum level or whatever, has become less important to me. And looking more at, certainly we still need the science and we need evidence and that kind of thing. But looking more as, in this case, IFS, as a framework for just thinking about what we experience as human consciousness and suffering and how to help ease that suffering.
Yeah, I love those two terms you used and had them top of mind all day today as I was thinking about this topic. Framework and a metaphor. And, it's interesting. I had the same response to when I signed up for the IFS level 1 training initially. I had both excitement and pause, that a same skeptical part. In my case, one that is, extra focused on the amount of empirical evidence that something has. And I had never actively sought out and invested a lot of time and energy into a modality with so little empirical evidence in the literature.
Right.
Like, because you have these other things like CBT, ACT, DBT. I'd done training in emotion-focused therapy. These have been around a long time, but I kept coming back to this same thing, this kind of experiential realization that this is useful for me. I've seen it be useful for clients, and along the way, perhaps I can contribute to that body of evidence. And these things come over time, and that's how we figure out the universe.
Right. Yeah, I concur. Also, the concepts in IFS are not necessarily unique to IFS, and Dick would say the same thing. I've heard him say it. The idea that we are a symphony of selves, as Fadiman's book title would say, is, as I said, not unique to IFS. Go all the way back to traditional psychoanalysis and the Freudian concept of the mind split between id, ego, and superego. Id being in the unconscious, not really readily accessible to the conscious mind, but still influencing, impacting our behaviors, our feelings, our thoughts, our tendencies. And that a lot of the problems, according to that model, that arise in a human psyche are the result of intrapsychic conflict, or the increase of libidinal pressure as a result of that conflict. So, and we can go over a couple others, but it's not that the idea of intrapsychic multiplicity or parts was invented by Dick. I think because he was so informed by his family therapy background, and he'd tried a bunch of things that weren't helping the clients he was really trying to help, he sort of discovered
an astute
internal family systems.
Guy who put the pieces together.
Yeah.
And in full transparency to the world, and cites these other modalities. I read this Jung quote the other day. It isn't a quote by Jung, but about his work that kind of speaks to some of the corollaries. It's by a guy named David Tacey, who wrote a book that's aptly called How to Read Jung. But Jung's conviction was that to achieve wholeness, one first has to go through the experience of fragmentation and experience the many parts of which the psyche is composed. The normal ego prefers stability and single-mindedness to the challenge of plurality and fragmentation. And this is why Jung argued that the sooner we can overcome the normal ego and aspire to the realization of the self, the more whole we might become, and the less terrified we would be of the fragmented parts that rise to meet us from the unconscious. Sometimes, he argued, the self is symbolized in dreams and artwork as androgynous because it points to a wholeness that transcends the ego and its gender. Theologically, he felt the divine should be imagined as both masculine and feminine so that human beings could focus on a higher symbol that combines the opposites. That I read because it's like an example of some of these bigger picture ways that Jung was wrestling with these same challenges, these same dualities.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the image of the yin yang symbol popped in my mind as you were describing that, right? Part of a whole, and then a little bit of each in the other, right? With the black dot and the white circle and vice versa. Yeah.
There's, so in a way, and I like this big picture view of parts that we're kind of starting from. In a way, that obstacle is the path saying comes to mind here, because you can take one of two stances when you encounter the symphony of selves within every human. Like one could be like frustration, or, oh no, I'm a hot mess. Or you can view it as like, this is the beautiful, kind of unique, individualized way we're comprised and developed through the course of our lives. And this is the prerequisite, this is a starting point for working on ourselves, right? It's like that is the doorway into the path of self-realization.
Yeah, and that right there, the non-pathologizing of in multiplicity was one of the first things that caught my eye about IFS in particular. That not only do we need to fragment, it's part of the growth process, but we are fragmented. It is our nature, and that's okay. You know, other methods of helping, whether they be medical, psychological, will pathologize certain parts of us. Like, well, I am an alcoholic. It's who I am, and I do this thing despite of my desire not to, that's destructive to me and those I love. It's something I need to change about myself, something I need to excise, take out, ablate, burn, like make go away. And IFS looks at it so much more compassionately, right? That maybe your tendency to drink alcohol in that way is a firefighter part. It's a protector, right? Trying to protect you from the intense feelings of an exile. This is now using IFS language. That has good reason, the exile, to be tender and intense, the firefighter having good reason to want to protect us from those tender, intense feelings. I really love this compassionate, non-pathologizing way of approaching.
Yeah, same. And another thing I noticed in practically speaking with IFS as a way to do parts work as a framework for clients is that it seems to be a more efficient way and a way that's more easily integrated, grasped, understood, and applied to life. I get the sense that there are many paths up this mountain. Like you could do Gestalt chair work, EFT chair work. You could have all these different, like Jungian psychoanalysis, deep dives, an hour a day on the couch or whatever it is. But parts work struck me as a very efficient and widely applicable path up the mountain if used wisely, prudently. You know?
Yeah, efficient, applicable, and approachable, right? Yeah. I've heard Dick talk about in interviews how he just noticed, this is something he came at a priori his clients with, but he noticed that people would spontaneously start speaking in parts, referring to their multiplicity. You know, imagine the person who's socially anxious. Part of them wants to go to the party, but part of me doesn't want to go to the party, and now I'm in conflict. I don't know what to do. And so a lot of people can just relate to that. I think what might be more challenging for some people to relate to is this idea of the capital S self, that it is present, according to Dick, in all people, and it is indestructible, right? It can't be harmed or destroyed. And he's never come across a client or a human being yet that doesn't have a self in this way.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes sense, right? That is the core of who we are. And I would say that concept of capital S self has probably been the single most useful thing for me personally in using parts work, is just the ability to recognize when you have a little bit or a lot of that capital S self energy on board. Because as we go throughout our day, we're either having ourself in the driver's seat, that seat of awareness, that one that's our core self with with all of our values and the big picture in mind. Or sometimes a part, like a protector part, for example, could take the wheel or the mic and take over, and we're reacting in ways that might be counterproductive, and our higher self would not do. And these 8 C's for me have been a way to like more and more quickly learn to exit that position of being kind of stuck in a part in particular that isn't serving the whole system in harmony, and just having a way to look for those qualities. And, even though there are a few too many C's to easily remember,
Right.
like for most people, just that concept is a damn good one, because in all the spiritual literature, you hear it called so many different things,
Right.
like whether it's Hinduism, Buddhism, like, or all the different Western kind of transpersonal ways of thinking as well.
Yeah. So for our listeners, like we kind of jumped right into this. For our listeners who maybe are less familiar with parts and IFS, I want to keep talking about this concept of the self. Maybe we can describe it and situate ourselves a little bit more. And then I've got a question for you about something you just brought up. So you mentioned the 8 C's. So the self being this durable quality of who we really are, that has space enough to hold all of us, that it is not a part, as Schwartz would say. It is us at our sort of most basic, the substrate of all beings. And that the 8 C's are just these qualities of the capital S self. And I've got them written down because, as you said,
They're on a little
remember them.
whiteboard somewhere in this office too, because I was using them in a session.
I even heard Dick forget one of them when he was in an interview. It was kind of funny.
Good.
But so the 8 C's: calmness. You could think of that as maybe equanimity, clarity, the ability to perceive situations without distortion from the parts, the extreme beliefs and emotions. Curiosity, you could think of this as beginner's mind. Non-judgmental awareness, like from that mindfulness perspective. Compassion goes without saying, or it's sort of self-explanatory.
Yeah.
Maybe empathy with boundaries. And then confidence is another. Feeling confident from that place that you can handle what comes up. Courage. Creativity, flow, intuition, spontaneity, and then connectedness.
Yeah.
The 8 C's. So, again, sort of one of the primary goals of IFS is to help people get in contact with self, and then to use the phrase that you did, to operate from a place of self energy.
Being self-led,
There you go.
you would hear it called by people in the IFS community. We'll use the word community.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, because we like it.
Yeah, I do. I love the IFS community. Maybe I may even become a part of the community, with my skeptical part on board protecting me. Because I, a long time ago, decided I would join no creeds. I would never be an acolyte.
And before I forget entirely, maybe just a plug for people to do some more research on it. If you are a therapist, whether you're formally trained in this or not, or deeply trained or a novice, you can contribute by doing case reports, case series. It's what I sometimes would call practice-based evidence, or where things begin and where kind of these movements of understanding are born and take shape. Like, for example, we did a pilot program at Numinus where we did, in a few different sites, group IFS ketamine therapy.
Right.
And over the course of, say, 8 or 10 sessions, a couple months, 2-3 months. And it was amazing. And we collected data because we use that data clinically. And you can go to these ethics boards, the IRB, and ask for permission to, in an anonymous way after, write things up. And you can always ask participants yes or no, depending on what you're writing. And you can contribute to the literature. And that's a beautiful thing. So that's just my little plug for all the non-researchers out there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good plug. So that's a little bit about the self, and you were talking about how it goes by other names and other psychotherapies, but also other traditions. And I'm wondering, given what you know about like mindfulness, right? You know a lot, steeped in mindfulness. like especially from this more Buddhist informed or yogic perspective, but also the way it's found its way into psychotherapy. Are when we're talking about the self, we're not necessarily or only talking about the observer or the beginner's mind or child mind, right? There's more to it, I think. I don't know. Just wanted to throw that out to see what you think.
Okay. So because I just have to answer the question in a Zen koan.
No.
It just feels like that's what needs to be done. But so, and maybe this probably won't answer the question, but so there's a student asks the teacher, what is the way? The teacher says, the ordinary mind is the way. A student asks, shall I try to seek for it? Teacher says, if you try, you will become separate from it. How can I know the way if I don't try for it? The way is not a matter of knowing or not knowing. Knowing is a delusion. Not knowing is confusion. When you really reach it, you'll find it as vast as outer space. Period. End of answer.
Yep, we can move on.
And so, yeah. But curious, before I even try for a real answer, what that brings up for you.
Yeah, I mean, when I listen to things like that, part of my mind grinds to a halt. Like the part of my mind that loves to know the way, to know exactly what to do along that way to reach the destination. And then there's a more expansive, I guess, part of my mind that's like, yes, I feel like I've been there. I feel like, to be me, I must sort of lose me first. To find oneself, you must lose oneself and divest myself of my attachments and my aversions. So, yeah, I'm not going to make a claim that I get the koan because that's dangerous, but it brings up a variety of different things, I guess. So that's my cop out.
Yeah. So I like what it brought up for me was just that the obstacle is the path in a very real sense here. Like that answer doesn't really tell us anything, but tells us everything. It really drives home that triggers are indeed the friends to follow here and show us the work. But to answer your question about ordinary mind, I think you get a lot of different flavors of this within the schools of thought in Buddhism. And one that I think is the most kind of modern and practically useful, or at least the one that I've had some exposure to, our friend and colleague Paul Thielken could speak a lot about, because his Zen teacher, Genpo Roshi, wrote a book on it called Big Heart, Big Mind. And it's this big mind approach that he drew from voice dialogue and that Hal Stone, I think his name was Hal Stone, created. And
and Sidra Stone, Hal and Sidra.
Yeah, and is a really well-developed therapy approach, kind of predecessor to IFS. They came at a different time and at a slightly different kind of framework, but this big mind because there's the ordinary mind, and I think it's kind of purposefully loosely defined in this kind of tradition that likes to answer in riddles. But this big mind concept is that state of consciousness that's beyond the ego.
Right.
And then he also describes this big heart, the compassionate aspect of an enlightened state. And so yeah, I really like the transpersonal or spiritual directions you can go with IFS. And that was a big part of my training, or at least one that really stuck with me from the IFS retreats, was just being able to use this tool to support your spiritual path as well. And I think it's a little hard to describe, but I think a simple way of looking at it would be that you can have a relationship and a dialogue with these bigger mind parts, or the big heart. And in IFS, it's all represented in this self, but in big mind, you have big mind and big heart, just like the different traditions tend to merge or separate the mind and the heart.
Right.
But it is all part of this capital S self. And so that's
Yeah.
I think one way of starting to piece it together.
Yeah. I mean, one of the thoughts that prompted the question was, I'm wondering if the IFS conception of the capital S self is more than just the infinite, expansive conscious container, the big mind and the big heart, within which we can notice and have awareness of, with compassion, all the things that come up, all of our parts. I wonder if it's more than that, because, if we're being self-led, the self in IFS is actually going to the exiles. It's going to the protectors, and it's doing work there, right? It's more than just sort of noticing and having space for. And according to IFS, it's going there and unburdening or retrieving and helping parts that are exhausted by their roles in the system, once given what they need, take on new roles. So it strikes me as just a little bit different than simply beginner's mind, quote unquote, simply.
And practically well suited for restoring harmony in our mental health and wellness.
Yeah.
And that's why it shows up so much in psychotherapy. I'd say primarily, in addition to this one that we probably don't give the weight it deserves, is like the role of spirituality in all of this. But I'll kind of set that aside for a moment, because, when you have exiles that are guarded by these protectors, like firefighters ready to bust out the biggest reaction at the first sign of trouble, or managers that are super busy keeping things well controlled, tightly over controlled, if you will, day to day, so nothing can get anywhere near that past wound that you may not even be fully aware of. That is having an impact and very likely limiting your experience of life, because of that walled off, lost, exiled part of you. And I love the part of parts work that says we can't get rid of parts. We don't get rid of parts, but we can unburden them.
Right. Yeah, because these parts, according to this theory, they have actually beautiful gifts, right? They have some uniqueness and something to offer. But because they've been burdened with the roles they currently have, then we don't have access to those gifts. So to your point, we're not eliminating them. We're unburdening them by bringing them love and compassion and understanding. And, in some of the exercises in IFS, these guided exercises of actually going back in time in your mind's eye and giving those little exiles the love and attention they needed, and that they can take on new roles that are supporting self-leadership. So very, very applicable and useful in a therapy context.
And think of how different the world would be if everyone had a framework on board where they were trying to have more of those, kind of indisputably positive qualities of the capital S self, of being like compassionate to other people. For example, if people had that on board, I'm thinking of like, extreme silly situation of like a dude in a bar who someone bumps into him, and he can either react from, a protector part that's, might take the mic, take the driver's seat and punch the other dude, and they both end up in jail for the night and with consequences. Or, if you have your, even some of your 8Cs on board, if you are self-led, there will be a very different decision that isn't kind of impulsively, reactively, not considering the good of all involved in this equation, including you and the other and the people around and your family and your livelihood and all those things that can be held, like you said, by this expansive self. If you're not in that place, the world can get a hell of a lot messier, and people are a hell of a lot more likely to harm one another.
Yeah. I mean, we talked about it in a recent episode about staying sane, right? In an insane world. If you want to see parts on display, just log on to Twitter. You're going to see a lot of protectors, and maybe even some exiles. But yeah, I mean, maybe it's a utopian fantasy, but I like what you're bringing up. I mean, imagine how parenting changes. Imagine how parenting changes when you're self-led. And then we
Yeah.
are stopping the chain of pain and punishment and the infliction of wounds with us as parents that we might have inherited from before. And then there is less
Yeah.
chance of those kids exiling parts of themselves in their childhood if they're being met with parents who are more self-led.
And it's an interesting example because I've heard it on many occasions used as an example of how we might try relating to ourselves like we would to a wounded young person who we love, like your own child, for example. Like, how would you speak to them about their pain, emotional or physical? And also, what's our dialogue inside? And can we approach it with more compassion? And some people, of course, need to approach their parenting with more compassion. I'll just say that too.
Yeah.
And also acknowledge that, like we said earlier, we all have this symphony of selves in there, and we all have times when we're not being capital S self-led, for sure. And we all make mistakes and we all hurt other people. And this is the starting point for doing our work. There's a Ram Dass quote that I just love, is like, I want my life to be a statement of love and compassion. And where it is not, that is where my work lies. And I think that's a beautiful mantra to try on. And in the context of this discussion, it involves getting to know your multiplicity of selves with compassion.
Yeah, and when he says that's where my work lies, the work again is not to get rid of those parts of ourselves, but it's to approach them with that love and compassion.
Yeah,
I love it. So I wonder if you want to pivot to a little bit of psychedelic conversation with respect to IFS, or if there's other things about IFS generally you want to discuss.
No, I think let's pivot into some practical applications. That sounds good to me.
So kind of like I think we referred to earlier, one of the reasons, well, I'll just speak for myself. One of the reasons I think IFS is a nice framework, a nice modality to use when doing psychedelic-assisted therapy, a few reasons, I guess. One is it seems to be the case when people are under the influence of psychedelics, and you could say the protectors are softened a bit, and ego dissolves. You get pretty ready access to these exiled parts. Part of the reasons we think certain psychedelics might be useful for the treatment of PTSD, right, in the context of psychedelic-assisted therapy.
They give you more awareness. They're amplifiers of what's in the psyche, and the stuff we're talking about is in the psyche.
Not only amplifiers, but they also help put you, depending on the medicine and depending on the person, into a more relaxed state in the presence of what's being amplified.
A vulnerable state where emotions can arise, old memories can resurface, things like that.
Yeah. So imagine in the preparation sessions for somebody about to embark in, or who's in psychedelic-assisted therapy, with this framework in mind, and they're maybe being taught this framework, doing some exercises, getting to know their internal family system.
Yeah.
So you're priming them well, and especially if they're able to get in touch with a little bit of that self energy, and then they go into what can be a fairly chaotic psychedelic experience, but they've got some resources. They've got a template upon which or through which the psychedelic experience can pass and manifest, and get them acquainted so that when something intense comes up and it represents a certain part of them that needs attention and work, they can lean into that work. And, maybe it's going to spontaneously manifest the capital S self, and they can have a lived experience of what that's like to be in self-energy.
You need to know the language in order to interpret the words that are being thrown at you, right? And I kind of view it the same way. So you need a framework, and there are lots of options there, and there are lots of languages you can learn as well. But yeah, that does go a hell of a long way in being able to integrate. I mean, that's what integration is about. In the end, it's reintegrating our self, our capital S self, our lost, disparate, disowned, disintegrated, exiled parts into wholeness.
Yeah. And there's this concept of polarization in IFS, how parts get polarized with one another. You got some protectors that don't like each other, for example. You can imagine a scenario in psychedelics where if you've primed in the way we're discussing, that these two previously polarized parts can negotiate, right? They've got the mediator of the self, perhaps, facilitated by the medicine experience.
Yeah. And those polarized parts are, I think, kind of fun to work with and fun to notice in oneself. And I've noticed that, like, extreme polarizations could be managers looking extremely cool, or our protectors being extremely cruel or whatever. But yeah, when you have parts at war or parts in a dispute, I think it's an example of where this modality can restore harmony pretty efficiently if done well. Yeah.
They did an exercise. I wonder if you did it in your training around this particular thing, where they had us identify two polarized protectors. And then with a partner, we played the role of these two polarized protectors, first arguing with one another, just, with all the gusto we could manage. And well, I think mine was, I have a part that really, really wants to work hard and perfect myself, and there's output and productivity. And then a part that just wants to chill, that wants to numb out, that wants to watch movies and play video games. So we've got these two, I guess you could describe them as managers, or maybe a manager and a firefighter. And so with my partner, we sort of had this argument, and then you pause, you take a breath, and then you say, okay, continue the conversation, but bring a bit of self-energy on board. Do it gently, and, maybe do some reflective listening between your parts and see how that feels different. And that was just so cool in this exercise to, like, feel what actually is happening in my mind, often like the arguments between these two parts of me and the collateral damage of that argument, and then feel the difference when you just sort of bring some gentleness to it.
It's pretty dramatic too when you try that out in relationship too. Like, if you talk to any couples therapist, they'll give some high yield practical advice of start to recognize when you're becoming flooded, or, saying things that, are triggering the behavior you want to avoid or counterproductive. You don't really mean, kind of getting more and more dysregulated, pausing, communicating that, coming back to it, with some self-energy. It's not like you have to have it all on board.
Right.
This is real life. But coming back to it in that different stance makes all the difference. The difference. Right. Yeah.
So that made me think. So circling back to psychedelic-assisted therapy, you'll often hear this phrase, don't mistake the map for the territory. Meaning you can have a sort of an understanding of what's going on in your psyche, but that's the map. It's not the territory. Territory is experienced. It's experiential. And so you can imagine in preparation doing exercises like this, where we're actually experiencing our parts, trying to bring self-energy on board, going through maybe some unburdening processes. So we're getting down into the territory, which I think would be good prep for psychedelics, because oftentimes psychedelics is like a Jumanji induction into the territory. When, it can be fairly jarring without when all you've really had access to is the map.
I love seeing how people, and more commonly males and females for whatever cultural reasons, but going into a course of therapy, especially parts work or psychedelic therapy in general, come out on the other side embracing all these things that they previously thought were cringy or cheesy, or would not have dared to do an exercise of reparenting their inner child, right? Or inviting compassionately a part of, like, I like to invite my parts for tea, right? And just that kind of approach, or when you dialogue with a part in session, it can be uncomfortable at first, but I just bring it up because that melts away pretty quickly out of necessity as you do this work. So don't fret. Yeah.
I do like the idea of inviting your parts for tea, and I've heard it described with other metaphors, like imagine a conference table or King Arthur's round table or something, and it helps with sort of the decoupling of the parts. Instead of feeling like we are, or we are, maybe in IFS terms, blended with our parts, that there's space for all of them. There's a seat at the table for all of them. And, we're going to try to help them so they don't feel like they have to dominate the conference room. But it's been a useful metaphor to use in my own mind when I try to do my own parts work.
The other one that's come up for me is sitting around the fire. But I remember before my IFS level 1, I was seeing an IFS therapist who I'd found locally, with the person I could find with the most advanced training in Utah, and she was awesome, guiding me through these sessions, and did a lot of like guided visualization work, which I appreciated. But in one of the first sessions, I remember her encouraging me to just, construct a scene where you're going to gather with these parts. And for me, and this has happened before, for whatever reason, it's this serene kind of mountain lake with kind of wooded nature around it, and there was this gathering place. And she even used that term, a gathering place, because you're building the relationship with these parts before pretending to be able to do much.
Right.
Like, you need to have a relationship. And the other thing I love about the modality is with the framework, the basics, you can kind of just be, and things emerge, and those become your trailhead, like body sensations, thoughts, meanderings, feelings. They're all potential trailheads to follow, and they all lead deep inside of you to this multiplicity of selves, one way or another.
Yeah, I like that. It's you might think of it as there's no way to do it wrong, by it meaning like exploring with curiosity and compassion what shows up. And as a clinician, using an approach like this, it's kind of liberating, because certainly there is a structure and a modality and a process and technique. Like
the 6 F's you would get if you do the training as one of the process models.
Right. Yeah. So there is that structure, but within that structure, I mean, what you're really trying to do is help people make contact, walk down those trailheads. And as they're walking down, if something else comes up, it's not because you're doing it wrong or this is interfering with the process. It's, another part needs our attention. Yeah. So let's investigate that.
Oh, hello there.
Hello there. Yeah.
What's your name?
And then, as Dick
Are
might
you friend
say,
or foe?
Friend or foe. Are you of love and light? And as Dick might say, that might be an opportunity to ask that part if it's willing to, recede
step
aside.
Yeah.
In the training, it was interesting. The person who was doing our training was like, "I'm not a step aside IFS therapist. That seems a little too harsh." The phrase she used that I liked is, "See if you can breathe yourself a little bit bigger than what's present, make space for it." And then see what the part needs.
Ask them if they want to join the party.
Yeah.
But that it does all start with that making contact. I like making the connection, building relationship, and then and there are different ways of doing that come from the trainings and the modality. But then once you've found the trailhead, you can kind of go through with those 6 F's, for example, and maybe it might help to walk through some of those as an example of how it works. But like we're talking about the first one, the first F, which is find the part. How does it show up? How do you sense it in your body? Notice the part of you that thinks that way and follow that. And how does it show up in your being, in the here and now, in a session that you can relay on as you find the part?
Yeah, and maybe we won't go through all the 6 F's, but this is an inquiry process. We've talked about other inquiry processes before, and nearly every psychotherapy that's experiential has something like this. And a lot of the folks that were in the early phase of IFS, a lot of the folks who influenced this development were Hakomi therapists. A lot of them, somatic therapists, trauma therapists. So there is a lot of somatic and experiential flavor to IFS and in this inquiry process. I mean, the next F I think is feel it, like feel into it. So you've found it, made contact, and okay, what are you feeling in your body? What are you noticing? That kind of thing.
Yeah. Yep. So there's find it, focus on it, like stay with it. What's it like? Are there words, images, sensations, emotions? I like that kind of creative exercise, trying to describe it in ways you wouldn't otherwise, like colors and shapes and
texture.
It is does stretch you creatively, I find. Trying to F the ineffable. And how do you then the next F would be, how do you feel towards it, which is actually the check for, do you have enough self energy on board to proceed on this trail?
Yeah, they were talking in the training how there's different folks who teach this maybe construct the 6 Fs a little bit differently, but part of focusing on it is also fleshing it out, describing kind of what you just, or according to what you just
find
described.
out the story and its function. Yeah, and that would come next in my slightly outdated framework. But that's a nice thing about it, is it's a framework and solid principles with sometimes a mnemonic or a collection of F's or C's or something to help you remember.
There's some P's in there too somewhere.
Yep. But yeah, there are important parts of the process, like asking the part what makes it so angry, or if it can trust you, and if no, letting it know you want to get to know that part,
what that's about,
when it's ready, and stay with it. And if you're just totally clueless about this, just keeping your attention and presence on that and seeing what emerges. And that's another beautiful part of the process, is just, it feels like practicing together with a guide, more so than like some of the formal traditional psychoanalytic psychotherapies, of course, or just or some of the manualized cognitive approaches.
Yeah, it's also a therapy that I think engenders autonomy in the client, because it's not that we are the knowledge keepers and we're trying to disseminate that knowledge, or we are the ones that are going to heal them. We're trying to help them get in contact with their capital S self so that they can be self-led and self-healing.
Teaching people to fish.
There you go.
Yeah.
As much as I love to give people fish, it's better to teach them.
Yeah. So and then comes befriending the part. It's all like happening along the way, but I like the F's, however many there are in whatever order, because, these are important parts to remember, like befriend that part. Does the part sense your presence? Is it okay to get closer? Because there is this kind of well-described fear or consequence in doing parts work, is you don't want to go in too abruptly, too harshly, in a too jarring way to extremely wounded exiles with intense protectors that could be re-traumatized, reinvigorated with more protective energy, or you could have the whole system on high alert all at once if you're not proceeding gently and with some wisdom.
Yeah, this is a gentle process, and you're often checking in for permission to proceed. It's not directive in the sense that you're telling them what to do, and certainly you're not issuing commands or orders. It's collaborative and gentle.
Yeah, it keeps the individual in the driver's seat, to be able to say, no, we're not going there today.
And I had that experience in one of our practice exercises out there, where I was the client in this particular exercise, and this one of my colleagues, one of the other learners, was doing a great job helping me explore my parts. And then at one point, the protector that had showed up kind of just shut everything down. I was experiencing some emotion, and so I started to feel the pressure behind my eyes that I might cry. And then all of a sudden, it was just like gone.
Tear squasher Steve showed up.
Exactly, right? Yeah. And to her credit, she picked up on it and sort of made space for it. Like, oh, I noticed something changed. What's going on? And, oh, there's a part of me that doesn't want me to cry for some reason. It's totally okay. Would that part like to share why it needed to do that? I just loved the gentleness and this concept. Like Dick's book, one of his books is entitled No Bad Parts, or that all parts are welcome. And if they need to have a voice, we're making space for them to have a voice.
For some reason, I get a kick out of this. It's not a part of IFS formally, but just getting creative in your visualization and internal description of the part. Like it could be this cowboy tear squashing Steve with a hat that gets off the horse and lassos you back in. It's like, hell no, Steve, you're not shedding a tear today.
Yeah, I loved elaborating on some of those images because I don't spend a lot of time, in quiet reflection. I'm just thinking a lot and doing a lot. When I do meditate, that's a nice break from that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I'd have a very active imagination, and I can be pretty creative. I grew up loving stories and writing stories and just loving to use my imagination. So doing this work lately as a 40-something-year-old dude has been fun to revisit that. And when I'm thinking about my parts sort of almost in a Dungeons and Dragons style, role play, giving them, outfits and intentions.
Yeah, the more playful, the better.
It's more memorable too.
Yeah, more memorable, more approachable, more fun.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I mean, what a way to build connection.
Yeah. So I guess circling way back to psychedelics, another thing that sort of popped into my mind that we often talk about, by we, I mean those of us who are doing psychedelic-assisted therapy and research, when referencing parts and psychedelics, and that is that sometimes psychedelics can take the protector parts offline against their will, would be one way of thinking about it. So you do all the preparation you can to make sure we have consent and buy-in from the parts that you're aware of. But you have this, what's sometimes called a rubber banding effect.
Your tear squasher might be put to sleep when in an ayahuasca circle or whatever.
Anesthetized. And then when he comes back into consciousness and he realizes you've been crying for 3 days, he's like, what the hell? And I need to reassert my role as a firefighter, to make sure you don't have feelings that make you cry. So that's possible. It's possible anytime we're inviting people into more vulnerability than they're comfortable with.
A vulnerability hangover.
There you go. So just for the therapists that are listening, and well, not just, but in case the therapists who are listening are extra interested, that's something to track and to make space for if happens. It's not that something you did necessarily wrong. Again, we want to try to get buy-in from all parts involved before we go into medicine spaces, but that is something to be aware of.
Yeah. Yeah. And also, many times people go into a psychedelic experience and then have something that, I don't know, dislodges them from their normal sense of self, like shakes up their snow globe of self-perception or just flips things upside down. And then you come out feeling a little discombobulated.
Yeah.
And how do you reintegrate into daily life, right? And what do you do with these kinds of experiences? And that's where, a framework, and therapists, of course, know this because, you're going to have frameworks in your quiver ready to use. We're talking about how this one plays out for us.
Yeah, and I've seen that in some clients who, understandably are nervous because they've read a bunch of stuff about psychedelics or watched some documentaries that the psychedelic experience is going to take away these parts of them that they've been relying on, right? Mm-hmm. These protectors are there for a reason, and a lot of times they get us through, and they can be functional in some important ways, even if they're double-edged swords. So, if I'm really, really ambitious, but I recognize that my ambition is a response to feeling like I'm not enough, but hey, I've got stuff to do. I've got a business to run. I don't want to lose my ambition. Is ketamine going to take my ambition away? Mm-hmm. So that's another, fairly common fear for certain folks and something to be aware of and that you could address with this framework.
Yeah. And one part of that I've seen come up for people is worried about that with regard to the exile, but I think it's just, it's important to remember, and I get this from, Jay Early's book, Self-Therapy, one of the early parts work books I read. He said, the burden is not the exile, not intrinsic to it. It's why it can be released. And the exile itself was not created by that childhood incident. That's what happened, and we're restoring harmony. And you mentioned it earlier, new roles for parts and protectors, and it may be foreign for a minute, and it does take, spending some time with the system, with these parts, for it to become, your default mode.
Yeah, one interesting aspect of the IFS process is once you get into it with one of those parts and it starts to trust self,
Yeah.
and it realizes and expresses why it adopted that role and that it's tired, you can ask it, if you didn't have this burden, if you didn't have to do this thing, what might you do instead?
Yeah, what would you like to do?
And you get some really interesting responses from these parts.
Then it's not, I don't know, I'm going to be fired. It's like, ooh, I can
Get reassigned.
I have some freedom. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, anything else? Of course, Reed and I are clearly IFS experts. If any of you are IFS therapists, you have likely agreed with everything we've said. Now, you can sense my, not sarcasm, but irony in my tone. More of just an exploration of something we're excited about and love, or I'm at least loving learning about.
Yeah, same. And always. And in fact, on that note, I saw this thing online the other day. It said, observing without evaluating is the highest form of human intelligence. Criticism, analysis, judgment is the lowest form. And it just made me think of this non-judgmental, compassionate stance that we're talking about here, applied towards all of ourselves internally and, to those we interact with, others outside, and how that can make all the difference.
All the difference in the world. Well, thanks, Reed, for indulging my trip report.
Thanks for doing the trip so we could chat about it.
I go out again in December for the second part of this, so I don't know. Maybe I'll have more to say after that. Thanks.
All right, stay tuned. Always a pleasure.
Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinus, a mental wellness company committed to tackling the global mental health crisis by delivering best-in-class psychedelic-assisted therapies, contributing to the body of primary and clinical psychedelic research, and fostering healing through community connection and social responsibility. You can learn more about Numinus at numinus.com. That's Numinus.com. If you enjoyed the show today and you want to support us, here's how you do it. Rate and review the show on platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Subscribe to the Numinus YouTube channel, like the videos, and share it. Share the show or clips of the show with someone that you think will enjoy it. The content of this podcast does not constitute medical advice or mental health treatment. Consult with a medical or mental health professional if you believe you are in need of mental health treatment.